Some say that life begins at 60. Others prefer to believe that it begins at 50 or perhaps 40. These are phrases repeated like cultural balms, designed to comfort those who feel the weight of time on their shoulders. But is there any real wisdom in these words? Or are they just well-intentioned illusions, created so that we don't face reality in its most naked form? Human beings have always sought consolation in the face of the suffering that constitutes existence. Every phase of life is filled with hope. First, the expectation of growth. Then, the search for success. Later, the desire for stability. And then, when energy begins to wane, the longing to start again. Not out of force, but out of necessity, like someone who, realizing they've lost their way, tries to find another shortcut to justify their walk. But time doesn't give back what it has taken. And this is precisely where the spirit of the so-called midlife crisis lies. The recognition that life, despite all our efforts, has not delivered what it promised. The long-awaited satisfaction has turned out to be fleeting. The goals achieved have faded faster than expected, and the dreams may never have been more than veils over reality. Today, I propose that we look at this moment not as a detour, but as a window to lucidity. Middle age is not a crisis in the pathological sense. Rather, it is a rare occasion, the moment when human beings, perhaps for the first time, see the world through disenchanted eyes. And this loss of enchantment, however painful, can be the start of something more authentic. Yes, youth has passed. The energy of yesteryear is no longer the same, but perhaps, precisely because of this, we now have the chance to live without the arrogance of haste, without the blindness of desire, without the noise of social illusions. Time reveals its truth, and with it, a hitherto unseen possibility. That of living with resignation, without unreasonable expectations, and finding in this a superior form of freedom. If life begins at 60, it's not because it gets better, but because perhaps we come to understand what it's all about. And this understanding, however late, is what allows us to walk with more sobriety, more silence, and more truth. The human being is by nature a being of desires. From the moment they become aware of themselves, they begin to project their happiness into the future, a future that always seems promising, even if it is constantly postponed. For decades, existence is sustained by this illusion, that at some point everything will make sense, everything will fall into place, and suffering will finally be replaced by a lasting state of contentment. But time, impassive, moves on, and the moment comes when the illusion begins to crumble. It's around middle age that the veil covering reality becomes thinner. Men and women, until then busy chasing goals, achievements, and approvals, wake up to a disconcerting realization. Much of what they have sought has been in vain, or, when achieved, has proved disappointingly short in its ability to satisfy. This is the background to what has come to be called the midlife crisis. This is not an individual failing, but an inevitable consequence of the very structure of life. It's about the collision between will, blind, incessant, insatiable, and the reality of human limits. By realizing that the time remaining is shorter than the time already lived, the individual is forced to acknowledge what they had previously avoided, that everything we want is ultimately unsatisfactory, that the world, as much as it offers stimuli, offers no real consolation. Youth is sustained by hope. Maturity, however, requires lucidity, and this lucidity hurts because it destroys the fragile foundations on which we build the idea of a fulfilling life. Many people, faced with this emptiness, try to resist. They seek out new experiences, reshape their appearance, reinvent projects. But rarely do such moves bring lasting relief. They are only temporary distractions from a truth that can no longer be ignored. The midlife crisis is therefore not an abnormal interruption in the course of life. It is the course of life itself, revealing its essence. It is the time when the mirror not only reflects the face marked by time, but also the soul marked by disillusionment. And paradoxically, it is precisely this confrontation with the truth that offers the possibility of serenity. Because if we understand that the will never be fully satisfied, we can perhaps begin to free ourselves from it. And this voluntary renunciation, this turning away from desire as the center of existence, can bring not euphoria, but something more valuable, a certain relief, a tranquility born of acceptance. This is not passive resignation, but practical. Wisdom to expect less, desire less, and thus suffer less. To those of you who have reached middle age and feel that the world no longer offers what you were once promised, know this. This feeling is not weakness, it's clairvoyance, and as bitter as it may seem at first glance, it opens the door to a more conscious, quieter, and therefore closer to the truth kind of life. The identity we cultivate throughout our lives is largely a construction shaped by desire. We spend most of our time trying to answer the question, who am I? Not on the basis of an immutable essence, but through our social functions, the roles we play and the goals we set ourselves. During youth and the first years of maturity, this identity seems solid. We are what we accomplish, what we achieve, what we project. We invest in the idea that when we reach certain milestones, a career, marriage, children, a house, we will feel complete. This is the project of will, a blind impulse that drags us into the future, always making us believe that the next step will bring the satisfaction that we now lack. However, there comes a time when the individual, faced with the passing of time, notices a strange restlessness. What once defined them no longer represents them. What seemed essential now seems superfluous. He begins to ask himself, who am I if everything I've built is impermanent? And even more disturbingly, who am I if everything I've wanted hasn't brought me the peace I'd hoped for? The midlife crisis emerges from this rupture. It's not just a reaction to physical aging, but a profound disturbance in the sense of identity. One discovers to one's amazement that what one believed to be the self was only a reflection of the will, a will that is never satisfied, that consumes the present in the name of a future that once reached is no longer enough. Schopenhauer reminds us that the will is the metaphysical essence of life. It drives us to want, to seek, to fight. But this force, when not understood, enslaves us. And so, for decades, many live under the domination of this blind will, without ever realizing that all satisfaction is fleeting and that boredom or frustration always return. Middle age is the moment when the veil falls, and the repetition of this dynamic becomes clear. At this point, many people try to rebuild their identity. They change their lifestyle, their habits. They look for new connections. In short, they try to rekindle the fire of youth. But these attempts often fail, because the problem lies not in the external world, but in the very structure of the will that inhabits the individual. The real opportunity of this moment, therefore, lies not in reinventing oneself as before, but in disidentifying oneself from what has never been essential. When the individual begins to give up, little by little, the illusion that their identity depends on achievements, they begin to approach a form of freedom, not the freedom to do, but the freedom to be. The freedom of someone who accepts the limits of existence, and precisely because of this, learns to live in the present with more serenity. It's not a question of denying everything that has been lived, but of recognizing that now the value lies less in what is built and more in what is understood. And understanding yourself at this stage of life is perhaps the only truly lasting achievement. Aging is, from a biological point of view, the inevitable process of matter weakening. Nature, indifferent to our will, follows its course mercilessly, as it does with all things that are born, grow, mature, and finally decay. No philosophy, no matter how optimistic, can deny the evidence of this physical decline. Muscles lose their strength, the skin loses its elasticity, the senses become slower, and health more fragile. Human beings, being endowed with consciousness, observe these transformations with anguish. He is not only the one who grows old, but also the one who knows that he is growing old, and it is this lucidity that makes the process more painful. For if there is one thing that characterizes our existence, it is the constant effort to deny the reality of finitude. For much of our lives, the body is the instrument of our will. It is through it that we seek pleasure, power, and security. But as the years go by, this instrument no longer responds in the same way. Vitality diminishes, and with it, the illusion that life is under our control. Many resist this, trying to preserve their youth with artifices, refusing to accept that time is sovereign. But this effort is in vain. Time, as Schopenhauer himself said, is that which prevents everything from happening all at once. It organizes decay, gives it rhythm, but does not suspend its certainty. However, if youth is the time for action, old age can be the time for contemplation. When the strength of the body gives way, the possibility opens up, not guaranteed, but possible, of a kind of lucidity that was not accessible before. For while we are strong, we are immersed in the world, driven by the will to do, to conquer, to prove. But as we get older, we are forced to stop, to observe, to reflect, and it is in this silence that true wisdom is sometimes born. Schopenhauer doesn't romanticize aging. He views it coldly, as part of the tragic structure of existence, but precisely because of this, he offers a way of understanding that the decline of the body can be the beginning of the decline of the will. And as the will weakens, so does suffering, not because of the absence of pain, but because of a decrease in desire. Of course, there is no glory in physical weakening, but neither is there glory in the illusion of youth. Both are phases of the same process. What distinguishes old age, when properly understood, is the possibility of a less agitated, less noisy existence, less enslaved to impulses. Growing old, then, can be, if well received, a time of recollection, a time when we no longer seek to dispute the world, but to understand it, in which the body, once a vehicle for restlessness, becomes a limit, and therefore a sign of rest. Physical decay is not the end of human dignity. On the contrary, it is where the value of conscience is tested. Those who manage to get through, aging without despairing but also without deluding themselves, demonstrate a rare form of strength, the strength of those who have learned to live with the inevitable. From an early age, we are immersed in a narrative about life, a kind of tacit script repeated generation after generation, as if human existence could be organized according to a manual. Childhood as a time of innocence, youth as a time of possibilities, middle age as a productive peak, and old age as a time of recollection and reward. That's the story we've been told. But like any cultural construction, it serves less to reveal reality than to cover it up. Society as a structure does not seek truth, but order, and to maintain this order, it builds myths. The myth of glorious youth, of professional achievement, as an expression of value of the family, as the redeemer of all suffering. We are taught to strive for these goals, as if they were guarantees of satisfaction, as if they were the meaning of life. However, reality, as always, does not bend to human fictions. The individual who reaches middle age or old age discovers, from personal experience, that the world doesn't deliver what it promises, that even those who have followed every step of the social roadmap often find themselves overwhelmed by a feeling of emptiness, a mismatch between what they have experienced and what they expected to find at the end of their journey. Schopenhauer would have bluntly said that suffering arises precisely from this illusion, that the world was made for our happiness. But the world, as he insisted, is not a theatre put on to please us. It is an incessant manifestation of blind will, which knows no higher purpose. Culture, in trying to organize chaos, ends up offering a fragile consolation, and it is this consolation that crumbles when reality imposes itself. When we get older, we see clearly that much of what we valued was vanity, that the comparisons, the deadlines, the standards of success were imposed from the outside in, and when we fail to meet any of these criteria, by choice or by limitation, we are led to believe that we have failed. But the truth is different. We have only failed to follow a fiction, and that far from being a failure can be the first step towards freedom. The story we were told made no provision for inner silence, serene contemplation, or voluntary withdrawal from the social race. It was written to keep us busy, active, productive, even when our souls are asking for something else. It is only with time that we have the chance to realize the mistake, not because we become wiser, but because reality, over the years, loses its varnish and reveals its real texture. And what is revealed is hard but liberating, that happiness in the way it was promised never existed, that true relief lies in expecting less, desiring less, seeing things as they are, not as they should be. This cultural deconstruction can be painful, but it is also a gift for those who know how to go through it lucidly. Once the illusion is shattered, what remains is not despair, but sobriety. And with it, the possibility of living the time we still have with more authenticity, more discretion, and less anguish. The human condition is, in its essence, marked by the constant tension between desire and reality. Throughout life, this tension manifests itself not only in individual desires, but also in the obligations that society imposes on the individual under the guise of morality, tradition, or good conduct. On reaching middle age, human beings often find themselves at the center of multiple demands. On the one hand, there are the children who are still emotionally or financially dependent. On the other, there are the parents who are getting older and start demanding care. The individual is then pulled in opposite directions with no room for themselves. Often without realizing it, they become an instrument for maintaining the will of others. This intermediate position, that of double caregiver, is celebrated by many as a gesture of nobility, as proof of responsibility and altruism. However, from a philosophical point of view, one has to ask, what is left to the individual after years of dedication to the wills of others? Where is their own peace, their silent desire for rest, their need to be more than just support? Schopenhauer teaches us that desire is an insatiable force, and this applies just as much to the desire for power or pleasure as it does to the desire for recognition. Society reinforces the idea that an individual's value lies in how much they can do for others. But in doing so, it also reinforces a cycle of self-annihilation. The more you offer, the more is demanded of you, until you are reduced to a shadow of your former self. Caring for elderly parents, for example, can be a natural gesture of compassion. But when this care becomes an absolute duty, with no room for choice or rest, it becomes a prison. In the same way, children, even adults, can continue to demand attention, resources, and presence, as if the role of parent would never end. The individual then no longer lives for themselves. Their existence becomes a mere extension of the needs of others. And the cruelest thing is that this happens precisely at a stage in life when the body begins to tire, and the soul, so often suffocated, begins to ask for silence, contemplation, and recollection. Culture doesn't make it easy for us to return to ourselves. It expects us to remain useful, available, and active. The pause is frowned upon. Tiredness is interpreted as weakness. The desire for solitude is interpreted as selfishness. But perhaps the real selfishness is to keep feeding a system that sucks the life energy out of people until there is nothing left of them. In this context, middle age can become a breaking point, a moment when, for the first time, you ask yourself, have I been living for myself or just for others? And if they have the courage to listen to this question sincerely, they may realize that it's past time to take back ownership of their own life. This doesn't mean abandoning responsibilities, but redefining them. It means understanding that living exclusively for others is no virtue, it's forgetting yourself, and that any true care begins with caring for yourself. The phrase "life begins at 40" has become a widely repeated motto in recent decades. There are those who believe that this statement offers the individual a new opportunity for rediscovery, as if maturity brought with it not only wisdom, but also a new existential vigor. However, if we want to look at this idea with philosophical eyes, not hopeful but honest, we must recognize in it yet another effort by the will to remain active, even in the face of imminent decline. For Schopenhauer, the will to live is an irrational force that constantly drives us to movement, to search, to restlessness. It knows no rest because it is always projected into the future, always lacking, always wanting. So when we reach middle age and realize that time has flown by, that many projects have been left unfinished, or that the promises of youth have not been fulfilled, the will does not remain silent. It reinvents itself, creating new goals, new illusions, new beginnings. In this sense, the dream of a fresh start is not necessarily freedom. It can actually be a new disguise for the same old mechanism, postponing acceptance. Instead of confronting reality, which shows us that time is finite, that the body changes, that possibilities narrow, the will creates the narrative of starting over as a consolation, as an escape. Of course, changing direction in life is possible at any age. It is possible, even necessary, to abandon what imprisons us and cultivate habits that are more in line with our current nature. But the belief that life begins from an arbitrary, chronological point reveals more about the fear of the end than about the beginning of something real. The real fresh start, if we can use that word, doesn't happen in terms of external achievements. It doesn't lie in changing careers, changing your appearance, or resuming old projects in new clothes. It happens, if it happens at all, when we finally understand that the will cannot be satisfied, and that we should therefore no longer blindly submit to it. This understanding does not lead to passivity, but to liberation. For by ceasing the unbridled search for future satisfaction, the subject can, perhaps for the first time, be present. No longer at war with time, nor in conflict with the past, but in silent repose with what is. Life doesn't begin at 40 or 60. Life begins when we stop deluding ourselves with the idea that it needs to begin in order to have value. Schopenhauer would say that the value of existence lies not in what we achieve, but in how we face life's inevitable suffering. And growing old with dignity doesn't mean reinventing ourselves as if we were still young, but understanding that there is greatness in recognizing limits and peace in accepting them. So for those who go through middle age hoping that something new will rescue them from monotony, philosophy offers another kind of answer. No more promises, but clarity. No more euphoria, but tranquility. And perhaps in the end, that's what really matters. As time progresses and life proves to be less generous than promised, many find themselves overwhelmed by a sense of emptiness. Projects have ended or failed, children have gone their separate ways, days have become repetitive, and it is at this point, often silent and lonely, that a desperate attempt at fulfillment emerges. Consumption. Modern society offers an immediate solution to the malaise of existence. It subtly and continuously tells us that happiness can be bought, that a new outfit, a trip, a sophisticated object, or even an exotic experience can erase the anguish that middle age so often reveals. And so we go on wanting things, as if each acquisition would bring us closer to lasting satisfaction. But, as Schopenhauer rightly observed, the pleasure gained from possession is always ephemeral. The human will by its very nature is insatiable. When we satisfy one desire, another soon follows. The joy of conquest is followed by boredom or disappointment, and so we enter a cycle: desire, acquire, become frustrated, and desire again. This cycle is not a sign of individual failure, but an expression of the structure of existence. The will moves us incessantly, but it doesn't allow us to rest. It promises what it cannot deliver, keeping us on the move even when the body is asking for rest and the soul for silence. Consumption, therefore, is not just an economic issue. It's an attempt to escape from oneself, to avoid confronting the truth, that we often no longer know who we are when we're not wanting something. When obligations cease, when the rush is over, there's only one mirror left, and in it, we can't always hold our gaze. The problem is not the objects themselves, nor the occasional desire for comfort or pleasure. The problem is the illusion that these elements can give us what no external condition can: meaning. And this is why, even with access to so many goods and stimuli, so many people remain dissatisfied, especially in maturity, when the limits of life become inescapable. The answer to this frustration, according to Schopenhauer, lies not in seeking more but in desiring less, in understanding that relief does not come from possession, but from the conscious abandonment of expectation. Lasting pleasure does not lie in constant excitement, but in the calm that comes when we stop expecting the world to complete us. Maturity, in this sense, can be a time of freedom, when a person, tired of chasing the promise of more, begins to turn inwards, not as an escape, but as a return. a reunion with what remains even when everything else passes. There's no need to deny small pleasures. They exist and have their place. But to place the hope of happiness in them is to walk into certain disappointment. True consolation lies in living soberly, with simplicity of desires and clarity of thought. Life as it is hard enough. Adding to it the false belief that happiness is for sale only prolongs the suffering. Renouncing this belief, on the other hand, can be the first step towards a lighter, quieter, and paradoxically more meaningful existence. Aging, although inevitable, is not a homogeneous event. Each person, as they go through it, takes on an attitude, even if unconsciously. And it is this attitude, not the grey hairs or the signs on the skin, that truly defines the way we age. Schopenhauer, with his relentless clarity, offers us no comforting promises about old age. For him, physical decline is a natural process, but the suffering that accompanies it can be softened by a philosophical understanding of life. To grow old is to lose, yes, you lose strength, you lose vitality, you lose much of what for years fed the illusion of permanence. But precisely because of this moment can also be liberation from everything that has enslaved us. Ambition, comparison, incessant desire. Youth is marked by the illusion that everything is still possible. Maturity confronts us with the reality that we are not masters of time, the world, or our own bodies. It is in this realization that, paradoxically, a higher kind of freedom can be born, the freedom that comes from conscious renunciation. Yes, we can choose how to grow old, but make no mistake. This choice is not about appearance, productivity, or social approval. It concerns the spirit. It concerns the way we position ourselves in the face of what has passed and what is yet to come. There are those who, as they get older, become prisoners of the past. They live on memories, resentments, nostalgia for what was or what could have been. There are others who cling desperately to their youth as if it were possible to reverse the natural direction of time. Both suffer, not from growing old, but from not accepting growing old. But there is another possibility, recognizing that each stage of life brings with it a task. Youth demands action, construction, and struggle. Maturity, on the other hand, demands detachment, reflection, and acceptance. It's not an easy path, because it requires letting go of what has defined us for so long, but it is a possible one. Wisdom, says Schopenhauer, lies in recognizing the limits of existence and, instead of fighting them, learning to live with them with dignity. The truly wise person is not the one who has overcome old age, but the one who has understood it. In this sense, growing old with serenity means stopping waiting. Stop demanding that life deliver what it hasn't promised, and in doing so, we find something rare, inner silence. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of agitation, not the absence of memories, but the absence of torment. Old age, then, can become fertile ground for self-knowledge. A time when we are finally able to be with ourselves without rushing, without masks, without the need to prove something to anyone. And in this stillness, we sometimes find the only peace possible, the peace that comes when we stop wanting life to be different and start accepting it as it is. To reach maturity is to go through the fog of illusion and find, on the other side, the real landscape of existence, one that is not built on promises, but on acceptance, not on what you can still achieve, but on what you no longer need to desire. If there have been disappointments, and there certainly have, let them not be cause for regret, but for enlightenment. Because every time reality has thwarted our plans, it has only fulfilled its role, to show us that life was not made to satisfy desires, but to be endured with dignity. Schopenhauer said that life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. This realization, however harsh it may sound, is liberating when properly understood. It invites us to abandon the expectation of constant happiness, and thereby relieves us of the burden of pursuing it. For those of us who today find ourselves in the second half of life, perhaps tired of the demands of the world, perhaps disappointed by what has not been, perhaps distressed by what is yet to come, philosophy offers not easy consolation, but an honest proposal, to live with sobriety, to see the remaining time not as a final race, but as an opportunity to silence, to contemplate, to be. The culture around us still insists on selling us ideas of new beginnings, rejuvenation and reinvention. But not all paths have to lead to external transformation. There is a type of transformation that doesn't appear to the eye, but which changes everything, the one that occurs when we stop wanting life to be different. Serenity is not born from the accumulation of experiences, but from the acceptance of limits. The true merit of old age is not in staying young, but in understanding that youth has passed, and that with it so has the turmoil of the will. What remains can be more valuable than all that has gone. Time to observe, to think, to simply exist without haste. It's not about glorifying suffering or denying the possible joys. It's just about removing the veil, seeing life with naked eyes. Without adornment, without illusions, without the constant need for more. And in that, finding a form of peace, perhaps austere, but authentic. Growing old, when accepted with awareness, can be a return to oneself. Not to the me that the world has shaped, but to the one that has always been silent, waiting to be heard. And it is this reunion, silent and invisible, that can finally give meaning to the remaining days. If youth is the time of searching, may old age be the time of understanding. And if something can still be desired, let it not be the prolongation of pleasure, but the relief of weight, the lightness of living with what you have, of being what you are, of expecting nothing more than what is possible. Because after all, it's only when we stop expecting everything from life that we start to see the little it offers as enough. And in that exact measure, between what you lose and what you accept, perhaps lies what so many have sought without finding, an instant of true peace. If this reflection made sense to you, enjoy the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive more stories and reflections like this one. That way, you won't miss out on any new content. Stay well and see you next time.